Perfect. Thank you, Shan. Thank you everyone for being here. It really means a lot to spend an hour with you all. The artist life is usually by ourselves and it's so internal that it feels really special to have time to be able to kind of share my process and some of my projects with you all today. So yeah, like I said, my name is Alicia Odell. I'm based in Wenatchee, Washington. Born and raised in Wenatchee, lived many places in between, and then came back about 4 years to Central Washington. And today I'm just kind of going to go over overarching, like, who am I as an artist, what inspires me, talk about my process a little bit. So just kind of like the evolution of my work. See if the slides work. I think they are. So yeah, with my process, it's very much place-based. And so by that, I mean, like, wherever I am, my surroundings and nature very much informs and determines what I'm making. And then I consider myself a multi-practice artist, meaning that, like, I work in different mediums. My first love was metal with jewelry, which is what I'll really be centering the talk on today, but also have been exploring fiber and sewing and weaving for the past couple of years, and have started dabbling in sound and video, but really going to focus on metal and fiber today, as those are my main practices. So I want to start off with this quote. I feel like it really sums up the why behind why I make art. If anybody's read The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, I love this book. I'm going to read a few quotes from it tonight. It feels like a daily devotional for creatives. And a lot of times I feel like he found words for things that I've experienced. And this one really stood out to me. So I will read it out to you. The act of creation is an attempt to enter a mysterious realm, a longing to transcend. What we create allows us to share glimpses of an inner landscape, one that's beyond our understanding. Art is our portal to the unseen world. And I feel like that is the essence of why I make things and why I keep coming back to art and trying to explore different mediums. It's being in that space, it's the process and the portal that it allows me. So how did it get started? I want to start off with kind of like the baby story of making things. I feel like from birth, I've been an observer and a deeply curious being. But the making really didn't come into my life until about middle school. I grew up in Wenatchee, and it's very much a monoculture. And what I mean by that is, like, growing up, the people in my circle, while unique and different, were making similar life choices. And so there was limited reflections for different choices and pathways that were surrounding me at the time. And then I found this bead store. If you are a local to Wenatchee or know, the Sundog Bead Company, which is no longer in existence, but was this incredible place. And it just sparked this wonder inside of me. Walking in, there's like batik fabrics, there's like bead glass from like Kenya and hand carved, bone beads from Ghana, and like silver from India, and there's music playing and there's incense burning. And I like never had smelled incense before. I guess I was pretty sheltered. But it was just this portal to another world of like, wow, all these beautiful trinkets from around the world. Like, there's so much beauty in the world, is so expansive. It was just this really magical place that I just wanted to keep spending more time in. And I kept showing up and like buying random little beads and not doing anything with them. And one day, one of the workers was like, "Do you want to make something?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think I do. Like, can I make something?" And so they gave me some like big copper gauge wire, probably like 8 gauge. And I picked out some beautiful glass beads, and they showed me how to like form it into this bookmark. I mean, like super 90s, and it was just the most magical thing ever. And I took it home and I put in like some book of poetry I had. And every time I looked at it, it felt like it transported me to like this bigger world and this possibility and the curiosity. And that is what like really made me fall in love with jewelry and craft. It was like connecting it to like curiosity and exploration. And with that, jewelry has really taken me so many beautiful places. It's ignited this just hunger for lifelong learning. I went and did the Peace Corps in Ecuador. I came back and found night classes at North Seattle Community College and was like going in and doing night classes, just squeezing it in whenever I could. Gone and taken classes in Chicago, did an apprenticeship in Portugal with a 4th generation metalsmith, taught jewelry in North Carolina and Boston. And so it just feels like this initial spark of wonder and curiosity is just continued with jewelry. And that just like, it just takes me a lot of places, which has been really beautiful. And then in the past couple of years, I was really looking for, I don't know, just kind of like taking a break from jewelry and looking to explore a different language. So I've been looking into, here's some weavings and some kind of like slow stitch and quilting projects that I worked on. And it's been really a great design practice to experience limitations from a different medium, which I'll go into a little further with another specific project, but kind of dipping my toes into another expression. And then with this little intro part, I wanted to bring in like, how am I connected to the Guild and kind of where this special place fits into my art practice. So I was really lucky to be an artist in residence just recently in February. And it was a really 3 weeks, 21 days. So it was short, but it was an incredible 21 uninterrupted days to go and be in a very special place. And with my time there, the focus of the time was like art making as a spiritual practice, which some of the themes in my work is like art as a way of like, you know, exploring curiosity, art as a way to kind of understand things. But then I wanted to take it a little bit further and say, like, is art making a spiritual practice? And what I mean by that was, how could I use kind of ritual and routines to connect with myself, attune with myself? And then how could I incorporate different states of consciousness into my process? And before I talk about the projects that I worked on at the Guild, I just want to explain a little bit like what I mean by different states of consciousness. So another practice that's been kind of woven in throughout this is kind of slow walks. So these are pictures from when I feel like these things are, these seeds get planted into our life, but then maybe our awareness or language to talk about them doesn't come until later. That's me, I'm a slow learner. And so I feel like I really became aware of how I was using walks during a time where I was living in Idaho in the Sun Valley area. It was a pretty isolating and lonely time for me, and I was really looking for a way to ground myself. And so I started going on these daily walks. It's so beautiful there. There's so many amazing trails. So these are pictures from a trail right by my house that I would go on almost every day, and just seeing how it would really be a grounding exercise and just an attunement to the surroundings around me. Nature is just a core value in my family growing up, like spending time in nature, respecting nature, paying attention to nature is just kind of the language of my family. And so that's what I went back to. But coming in with the creativity, really realizing how these walks were putting me in a different state of mind to access these kind of alpha brain waves, to be like more calm, more relaxed. You can access your creativity, right? It's like a softerness than our typical like beta goal seeking linear check the boxes, kind of like my brain, my business brain that I wear sometimes. And so really feeling calmed and connected by that. And then seeing how these creative ideas would come up when I was on these walks. And so this process of going on walks and taking pictures has been a regular practice ever since. It's a big part of my creative practice. So here's just some pictures from around. And so coming up to the Guild and being like, how am I going to really take advantage of these 21 days, and knowing that these kind of like different states of consciousness is really a core way for me to dig deeper into my creativity. And I was just wondering, like, are there different ways that I could access flow or alpha brain waves? And so it kind of led me to this idea of a slow stitch project, where if people are, I think someone mentioned slow stitch, but basically just kind of like a soft practice of like you're not really doing a lot of thinking. Maybe think of it as kind of like an improv, and it's just like repetitive motion and getting lost in the process. And so I set up this practice I was going to do 21 pieces. These were about 8 by 13 with a drop cloth and then linen on top. And just to do a free stitch every morning when I got to the fiber arts studio. And it'd be anywhere from like an hour to 3 hours of time, depending on how many stitches I was doing in the design for that day, to really open myself up to be receptive to work on other projects, and knowing that accessing flow helps me better access my creative process and to be able to be more in that design mindset. So I worked on that and ended up making 21 little flags of sorts. And there's like a little detail picture of that. And then using that to launch into this practice, the secondary project, which is what I'm often doing with that, coming back to the place-based art, is translating my surroundings. And so really focusing on 3 aspects, one per week that I was there, looking at the pine needles. It was February, it was super snowy and cold there. So making a quilt out of the pine needles and the snow, looking at the frozen lichen, and having that daily stitch and accessing the flow in a different way than the walks helped me be open to design these projects. And then the 3rd week, I focused on the river, being right there, staying in the river house where Shan's living now, and just waking up and seeing and listening to the flowing river every morning was very inspiring. And so here you see like a little quilt square that was inspired by the river. And then coming back home, I really kept thinking about these designs that I worked on, and wanting to translate it back into metal, and thinking like, what would this look like if I translated it back into metal? So kind of like adding on these design layers to it. And so I designed some earrings that were inspired by the river and like the metal interpretation of the fiber, and just seeing how these designs land differently with the different properties of a different material was really interesting. And then I also made a river brooch out of that design. So that's kind of like a very long-winded intro, and then how I'm connected to the guild. But now I kind of want to launch into some specific projects to talk about the process of that, and kind of going back a little bit from the guild, connecting with this idea of communicating and translating between fiber and metal and translating landscapes. This really started several years ago. I think this was maybe 2016 when I worked on this project. I was living in Boston and was coming home for 2 weeks and really wanted to have like an art practice, but didn't have a jewelry studio. And so I thought, what can I do for a little art project? And so the plan was to go around to my favorite places around the Wenatchee Valley and take pictures and translate them into quilt squares. And I was calling this project a practice in listening. So really like paying attention and attuning myself to the surroundings and seeing what stood out. And this was really a beautiful, I didn't realize it. I just did it out of practicality to say, well, I don't have a torch or metal, so I'll do fiber. I've been exploring sewing for a while. But then I started making these squares and realizing what a limitation it was for me. I didn't have the skill level. I've been working in metal for over 15 years, and was just a baby in sewing. And I was like, oh, it's so different and it's so hard. And I don't have the dexterity in understanding in the fabric. But it made me have to change my design, which was super interesting. So here is on Highway 97, heading up to Chelan, this little tunnel, and I'd ended up making the quilt square out of that. And originally it was just an idea to design challenge. But then when I got back to Boston and had access to a studio, I really wanted to keep thinking about this idea. And I thought, man, could I translate this idea in fabric back into metal? So I ended up making a brooch out of, and working on this whole series of all these squares of these places and turning the quilt square into a brooch. And here's another example of that with some grass that's coming out of the snow. So here's like the little, very minimalist little quilt square, and then translated that back into a brooch. And it was really fun. And it was helping me learn so much about how I work and design in different materials, but also to be able to compare to see what does a quilt square of like the snow and grass look like in fabric, and what does it look like in metal. And so here's a couple more from the series, and it's something that has really become a regular practice of mine of translating back and forth between the two. So here's BB Bridge. Here's some wind-breaking trees, some mountains as you're coming back down from, I think, Omak, and some grass coming out. And just kind of like thinking about this, I don't know, just really, it really impacted my design process, and kind of keep coming back to this format, and just a really great way of reminding me that nature is really my greatest teacher, and that art is a way for me to kind of explore that deeper. But then I think also why this was pivotal is like, one, it wasn't always only this like amazing design challenge, but it really got me starting to think about like art as not just a way to like kind of translate, right, this design challenge, but like the internal workings of like art is a way for me to process and to understand and think about these greater messages from nature. And so that led me to another project that I called Expand Outwards and Inwards, another brooch series. And I'm sharing a lot of brooches. I don't only do brooches, but brooches to me are such a beautiful little canvas, and it's often in metal where I start, and then I'll iterate into maybe earrings or a necklace. But brooches feel like this perfect little canvas for me. So if that's why maybe it feels like I'm talking a lot about, and I love brooches tonight. So this little series of just 3 different brooches. This was during 2020. We're in the pandemic, or just coming out of lockdown. There's so much fear, political divides, the murder of George Floyd. People are out in the streets protesting, vaccine mandates, right? And then I just feel like this has been coming, but like this gender expansiveness, like so many institutions and ideologies are being put into question, and people are like in the streets, like, you know, yelling at one another about these things. Like there's just so much going on. It was just like a really tense time to be alive, as we all know. And then I went to Glacier National Park, and here's this picture at the top right-hand corner of Lake McDonald, and the water is so peaceful, and you just see this perfect reflection of the mountains in the water. And I'm just like struck by the vastness and the spaciousness, and it just reminds me about how these vast wild spaces in the West, like this reflection to us, to be like, there's so much freedom, and I feel so free in these spaces, and like, what could this teach me? And thinking about like, how can I mimic and reflect nature? How can I evolve beyond myself? How can these limited ideologies that I hold on to for comfort or out of fear, like, and these identities that I hold on to for comfort, like, how are these things limiting me? And how can I look to nature to find ways to kind of embody more spaciousness and kind of like release myself from these labels and boxes that I check? And so that's why you see these pieces of slate that were collected there next to these like hollow forms, just kind of like implicating like, how can I be more like nature? How can I have more internal spaciousness? And this is going to be, I'll show you some more examples. This is an idea I'm still thinking about all the time, to keep being more expansive and letting go of these limiting ideas. And another quote from Rick Rubin, I promised you all. But I just feel like it found the words for me. So he wrote nature, because it's like, why, what is this thing? Like, why do I keep coming back to nature? Why is it important to pay attention? Why does this make me feel good? Why is this grounding? Like, what is this that keeps coming back to me? And so he says, nature transcends our tendencies to label and classify, to reduce and limit. And the closer we get to the natural world, the sooner we start to realize that we're not separate. And that when we create, we're not just expressing our unique individuality, but our seamless connection to the infinite oneness. And I feel like, I was like, yes, this is why seasonality is so beautiful to me, and like paying attention to these short little seasonal blooms or paying attention to the weather. I mean, I feel like that attunement for me helps me expand beyond myself and connected to this infinite oneness that he talks about. So as I said, these are some more recent pieces I've been working on. This spring, I was doing a lot of hikes around Grant County. It just warms up a little faster. And going and making these little brooches that kind of embody the energy of these really wide open, vast spaces. So this top brooch is from Ancient Lakes, just outside of Quincy. And then the bottom brooch was actually some jasper that I found at the Goose Lake Plateau, which is a really amazing place between kind of like by potholes, state park between Moses Lake and Othello. And it's just an incredible, wild place. So still thinking about that. And then another project, my most recent project, I'm calling it the Vibrancy of Tenderness. And this really came from these same ideas. So I'm just showing you different projects, but as you can see, I'm still chewing on the same ideas over and over again. So I live in Wenatchee, and this spring I was just really in awe of like the beautiful blooms that just bring this lushness to what's typically a very dry, arid place. And so I live by the Jacobson Preserve here in Wenatchee, and was going on these daily walks and was seeing the first buds of the balsam root. That's that yellow bloom in the pictures. And then the lupin, you can see the little purple blooms in the right-hand picture. And there's a little bit of the bitterbrush in the left-hand picture, those little tiny yellow blooms. And just feeling like, this like breath of fresh air, the springtime is here, the warm weather is coming. And this landscape is just so lush and inspiring. And it transforms so quickly. And I just wanting to savor this season, because I'm like, I know it's only a couple of weeks because the heat's going to come and the blooms are just going to melt or fry, I should say. And so I was going on these walks like several times a week and just like paying attention, like, ooh, more blooms, or like there's more blooms in this area, or over here it's slower, and just paying attention to all these things and really just holding on to these moments of this season. But then sure enough, the heat came and the blooms start fading. And I was like, wow, it's such a beautiful moment. And then kind of sad that it's gone, because you won't experience this for another year, but it's beautiful because it's this moment that you were able to experience. And starting to wonder if like this beauty is magnified by the limitations and like the fragility of it. But then the wonder of like this miracle that like all these elements come together to allow this tiny season to kind of exist. And the contrast, like it's so beautiful because it's such a contrast to the normal muted colors, that there's just like this tenderness to this beautiful little season. And thinking about kind of like that deeper learning to be like, we so often attach value to time, and like, how can I bring this understanding to my daily life? How can I practice like deeper presence and release the need to attach value in time? Because this moment was so beautiful, and it doesn't have to last forever. And maybe it wouldn't be beautiful, it was forever, but can I release it? Can I appreciate it and release it? Right. And so those were kind of like these ideas that came to mind when I was going on these walks. And so I was thinking about these shapes and designs and like, how do I translate this into jewelry? It's this beautiful moment, but for me, wanting to really process it, that's where the making comes in. And so for this, bringing in another limitation, because I found I love challenging myself and making in limitations. I started playing with paper, some cardstock, and thinking about the shapes of the blooms, specifically of lupin and balsam root, and kind of cutting out these shapes and thinking about kind of like the abstraction of this. I don't want to make an earring that looks like a balsam root, but like, what's the energy behind it? And what are the shapes as I remember it in my mind? And so kind of cutting out these shapes, and then is the first iteration. And the second iteration really comes when it comes to metal. So here are some studio shots of me playing with like 1 layer and 2 layer of this formed metal piece, and then ended up with this kind of a small collection of pieces. And you can see like the bottoms are really inspired by the shape of lupin, and then the top piece is really kind of an abstract interpretation of the balsam root petals. And then you've got the circle ones which are the center. So that's kind of like how it landed and how I was able to kind of like translate that season. And then going back to this idea of metal and fiber, sometimes it is, I go from one to the other. But lately, I feel like I've really been wanting to talk simultaneously in both of the languages. And so this was an interesting challenge for me. So I was working on the paper forms, putting them into metal, making this little series. And then I started working in fabric and started sewing a little quilt. And, if we go back to the brooches, right? It was such a literal translation to be like, I think it's really obvious to see that this is grass and this is grass. And so they're different, but it's more, it's accessible to see what I'm talking about. And so I struggled a little bit. I even thought about not including the fabric part in this talk because it looks nothing like these pieces. But to me, I thought, no, this is the beauty of speaking in 2 different languages, because it totally, being in the fabric, it allowed me a totally different perspective. So with this piece, it was really where I ended up landing. This started off as just an improv, wanting to do a basic 9 patch and just iterate from there, being like, I really see this as kind of like a patch of the fading balsam root bloom, whereas the jewelry was abstract parts and shapes. And that's beautiful too, with seeing the design from that. So I wanted to share that with you. And yeah, I think this is all, that's a lot. It was hard. I was telling Shan before we got started, it's like hard to say all these things because my brain goes in so many different directions, but I hope that gives some insight to just give you more ideas on like kind of who I am as an artist and how I process and work through design ideas and the things I'm thinking about when I'm making them. So thanks for listening.